Right.
You can't put it in the way of the camera.
Here we are.
It's okay, I really like this thing.
Oh, that's
I want to
good.
move
Yeah.
back. I hate being on the camera.
Take it away.
Okay. The journal article that I did was in vivo testing of the functional integrity of the corticosterone producing axis in mud puppy exposed to chlorinated hydrocarbons in the wild. And an introduction, like the general, what brought about to this journal article is kind of the general concern towards like the decline of mud puppies and actually generally amphibians. And things like mostly like contamination, they've noticed decreases like population, and contamination has an impact on physiological integrity, and there's also an impact on the hypothalamic pituitary interrenal axis, which I'll just call it HPI. And HPI is pretty much a big part of complex signaling and regulation of vital processes, and like even things like metamorphosis, food foraging, and mating. Like they're influenced by the rhythms of the secretion of corticosterone. The two main corticosteroids that are synthesized in the system are aldosterone and corticosterone, and out of the two, corticosterone is the most prominent. And corticosterone release promotes gluconeogenesis, which we learned about last class, and is also able to restore depleted carbohydrate reserves in the liver, along with playing a role in hydromineral balance of amphibians. And that's just the structure of corticosterone. There have been like a lot of studies on acute exposure to toxic substances, whereas acute is just like short and sudden, and during acute exposure there's hypersecretion of corticosteroids, and eventually the secretion rates will be able to return to basal levels. Whereas chronic exposure is not as studied, and there have actually been some recent field studies that provide evidence that chronic contamination can reduce the fish's ability to elevate the blood cortisol in response to acute stress. And also exhaustion along the HPI axis is induced by prolonged toxicant-invoking hyperstimulation. So contaminants at multiple sites, can affect at multiple sites on the HPI axis, so it can have different degrees of effects at different parts and everything. And also contaminants some are adrenotoxic compounds, which affect the adrenal gland. And TCD accumulation occurs. TCDD is tetrachlorodibenzo-P-dioxin, and it can accumulate in the adrenal gland of mammals. And we also see that DDT, or dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane, can irreversibly bind to the proteins of the adrenal cells, and that these adrenal cells that are once activated by P450 enzymes. You can also have pathological lesions, and organochlorides have the ability to modify the activity of enzymes that are involved in the biosynthesis of corticosteroids. And with contamination, you can also see that there is impaired control by the pituitary corticotropes of corticosteroid, followed by TCD exposure, and that is attributable to secretion of a less bioactive form of ACTH. And basically the main purpose of this study is to test the physiological integrity of the HPI axis in the mud puppy that has been chronically exposed to chlorinated hydrocarbons. And they kind of did two phases. And the first phase was to compare the response of corticosterone to acute stress exposed in different degrees of contamination in two different systems. So there's two river systems that they took the mud puppies from. And in phase 2, the mud puppies from the contaminated and the reference area were recovered before being exposed to restraint stress and in vivo ACTH stimulation. After this, liver glycogen and plasma glucose were quantified, and a degree of change measured along the HPI axis was measured through histomorphometric analyses of intrarenal cells. The species studies was mud puppies, Nycurus maculosus, and they're an aquatic salamander, and they're what you would call a bottom feeder, so they're kind of just hanging out on the bottom of the stream or whatever they are. They have a pretty high lifespan, and they have little or no movement. And as I said before, there's been kind of an apparent disappearance from water sources. The sampling sites, I don't know if you can see them, but there's two rivers, the Ottawa River and the St. Lawrence River, and they took samples from 9 different sites, 5 from the Ottawa River and 4 from the St. Lawrence River, which I'm going to abbreviate. St. Lawrence River is SLR and Ottawa River is OR, and they each had their own reference sites. In the Ottawa River, it was the Quesnel Bay, which is right here, and in the St. Lawrence River system, it was the Batiscan River, which was right here. And what they did first was they measured the in order to get find the reference site and everything, they measured the amount of contamination that were in the gonads of the females. Methods. There are a lot of methods. The first method that they did was they captured the mud puppies from the rivers by baiting the traps with dead fish, and they set them under ice, and they put them down during what they called their foraging season, which is between January and March. And they basically put the cage in at sunset and left it, and then took it out in the morning, and they didn't leave them for more than 16 hours. And basically the reason they put it in at night was because they figured that night would be a low stress situation for them, so they wouldn't induce more stress on the mud puppies. After they were taken out, their total length, snout bend length, and total weight were measured, and the anesthetized animals were euthanized by spinal cord rupture, and the others recovered were put in oxygenated river water until the effects were gone. First thing I did was functional challenge of HPI axis, and this was done in 1992-1993. These are two different studies, one in 1992-1993 and one in 1995. And in this study they took 40 mud puppies, 20 males and 20 females from each site, and then confined them and put them in an anesthesiation. They anesthetized them in a buffered MS-222 solution. They then took a blood sample from the caudal vasculate, which means it was on their tail region and their vascular system, and it was taken with a heparinized syringe, and they separated the plasma through centrifugation to analyze for corticosterone. And after this, the liver, gonads, and stomachs were all dissected and weighed. The responsiveness to ACTH and acute stress after recovery was taken in 1985. There were 3 steps: recovery, ACTH challenge, and acute restraint stress. As I said before, the recovery was just to get them back to their normal levels of, so they don't